a new chess game in Zen mode, which means I don't know my opponent's rating. It will be revealed to me at the end of the game. There's a bit of suspense, a bit of surprise that way. I started with the pawn to e4. He plays the pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense. Interesting. I play knight to f3 to support the d4 push. There are several variations for black in the Sicilian defense. Some people know the dragon variation with g6, but here we have d6. So after d6, usually you advance the pawn to d4. But I also like it. Bishop to b5, check. But I'm going to play the d4 pawn anyway. He takes. And usually you recapture with the knight. Here, I'm going to surprise him by recapturing with the queen. This is a sub-variation. I know my queen can be attacked by knight to c6, but there will be bishop b5, the pin. And at any moment, I can exchange the bishop for the knight. They play bishop to d7. Here, for example, I could exchange the bishop for the knight, but I would activate his bishop on c6 too quickly. I'm going to make a small retreat to d3. On the other hand, if he plays a 6, I'll take his knight, but he will have lost the tempo with that move to a 6. And he will have weakened the b6 square, the dark square. Why am I talking about this dark square? Because if I give up my light squared bishop for his knight, I'll then have one more piece to play on the dark squares. Because his light squared bishop won't be able to play on the dark squares. He plays knight to f6, and the whole point of my variation is that my queen protects the d4 pawn. So I'm not forced to play knight to c3 to protect that pawn. And I can insert the move, c4, and then play knight to c3. That way the wing pawn will allow me to control the d5 square. This is what's called a pawn structure with the Marocci bind. So I'm creating a bind, this double control of the d5 square, and that's called the Marocci bind, because it was the player named Marocci who theorized this pawn structure against the Sicilian. My opponent plays the pawn to a 6. So here, I'm tempted to play knight to c3. Other moves can also be interesting. For example, bishop to f4 to start targeting the d6 pawn and try to provoke it to play e5. That way it will create a hole on d5 for my knight. But I'll start with knight to c3. So in this position, I might end up exchanging the light squared bishop for the knight. Therefore, I'll need to attack on the dark squares, especially the weakness of the d6 pawn, which is a backward pawn on an open file. It's quite easy to target. But I'm not obliged to exchange the light squared bishop for the knight. I can also bring my light squared bishop back to my side. But since I have pawns on c4 and a4, it will still be a bit passive. So my opponent plays bishop to e7. I'm going to prepare to castle. He'll probably castle as well, or slip in a6 first. Castling not only shelters the king, but also brings the rook into the fight. To e1 to defend e4, or to d1 to put pressure on d6. But as long as he has the dark squared bishop, he defends the d6 pawn well. And this is where I'll have to think, because I have several interesting moves. Rook to e1, rook to d1, or developing the bishop. Where to develop it? To e3, f4, or g5? There are several possibilities. If I play bishop to g5, I can threaten bishop takes knight. If he recaptures with the bishop, he loses the d6 pawn. But on the other hand, he would have a nice dark squared bishop on the long diagonal. And after bishop g5, bishop takes f6, he recaptures with the pawn, which messes up his kingside pawn structure a bit, but it holds square d6. It will be much more difficult for me to win on black square. So I'm watching. Crazy f4. I have this double attack on the d6 pawn, and soon a triple attack, and that could be very interesting. And as I told you, I'm not scared or crazy. f4 playing e5, because it weakens cell d5. And now I'll play bishop to g5. Because if I take his knight, even if he recaptures with the bishop will be blocked on the long diagonal by his own pawn on e5. So I play bishop to f4. I connect my rooks and target the weakness of the backward pawn on d6. And you see this Marocci bind, the pawns on c4 and e4, which control the d5 square well with the knight and the queen, to prevent the d5 push. So I have a space advantage and a target on d6, so he plays a6. If I take his knight, he plans to recapture with the bishop, so that the queen can defend d6. And at the same time, his bishop will be well placed to attack my pawn on e4. So if I try to win the d6 pawn at some point, for example, with the rooks on d1, I'll have a problem on e4. On the other hand, I'm looking at bishop takes c6, bishop takes, and knight to d4. My knight will put pressure on his bishop, although he's not really afraid of me taking it, because the pawn will recapture, and that will help him defend the center. He'll have a lot of pawns in the center. But that frees up my f-pawn to play f3 and consolidate against his bishop. So that could be interesting. Or I don't take his knight and I retreat. Bishop to f4, for example. Maybe that's the best move. I came to b5 mainly to take the knight, but maybe the best thing is just to play x4. So after bishop takes c6, bishop takes knight on d4, there's the e5 push that creates a fork. But I can take on c6 first to attack his queen. He'll take back and I'll have to move his bishop. But the difference is that now the d5 square isn't weak since he has his pawn on c6. Of course, after bishop takes, he can't recapture with the pawn because then he'd lose the d6 pawn for nothing. Honestly, for now, I don't know which move is best. I'm just going to play. Bishop to a4. I'm going to keep up the pressure. Maybe there will be opportunities to exchange at a more favorable moment. I'm not sure if my rooks should be on c1 and d1 or on d1 and e1. He plays knight to b4, attacking my queen and my bishop, which is protected. But I'm going to play queen to d1. Because when he takes, I need to be able to recapture with the queen so that the knight continues to protect the e4 pawn. All right, I'm going to play queen to d1. If he doesn't take, maybe I can push his knight back with a3. If he goes back to c6, now I have to take on d6. So he takes. Queen takes a4. I'm attacking his knight. He can play d5 to free his bishop and defend. But there's a big fight on d5. He prefers to go back to c6. And now I think I'm going to put a rook on d1. I don't know which one yet. Should it be the rook from f1 that comes to d1 or the rook from a1 that comes to d1? I don't know. I'm going to play the rook f1 to d1. But this rook could also have gone to e1 to defend e4. That's always the problem. You never know which rook you should move. I'm sure that happens to you too. For me, it's a recurring issue. I never know which rook to move. So there's still this pressure on the backward pawn on d6, but I'm also under pressure on the pawn at e4. There are no more white square bishops in the position. I have a structure with a space advantage. So is this push to e5 a threat because I'm attacking his knight and his pawn on d6? He could play knight to h5, attack my bishop. I could take his pawn. He could take my bishop. I could take his bishop here, but he could recapture with the queen. I don't know if that's interesting. You see, after the push to e5, there's this knight to h5 move that's problematic. After that, I can simply reposition my bishop to e3. Anyway, his pawn on d6 is pinned, and if he takes with the knight, I could capture. And if he recaptures, of course, he loses the queen. So I can play this move to e5. And after knight to h5, I go to e3. And in the end, his knight is badly placed. And I still have threats of capturing on d6. We can also look at bishop takes, and then e5. Knight takes because his bishop is pinned. I still think f5 is stronger. He plays queen to b6. He unpins himself. He weakens d6, but he counterattacks on b2. He also puts pressure on f2. Watch out for moves like knight to g4. The knight could team up with the queen, and that could be dangerous. So can he really take on b2? For example, if I play bishop to e3, queen takes b2, because sometimes the b-pawn is a poisoned pawn. It's in my territory. It's not certain he can get out. But it looks like he can get out because he's attacking my knight. That's the problem. If I play rook to b1, he comes and takes the knight here. And then his queen is able to go back to f5, protected by his own knight. Bishop to e3, queen takes b2. I might be able to protect the knight before playing. Rook to b1. For example, I play rook to c1 and now I threaten rook to b1. I could play d5 to free his dark squared bishop, because after rook to b1 he would go to a 3, protected by his bishop. It's getting complicated. Maybe I can just play b3 as well. After the move b3, I cut off the retreat squares for my queen, and coming to a 3 will never be an option. He'll try to play d5 and attack my queen. But if I bring my queen back to c2, I get hit with knight to b4. Maybe it's not that bad, actually. queen to e2, and I defend b2 and f2. I'm really tempted to play f3. I think that after queen takes b2, there's a way to catch his queen, but I didn't see it. And it's risky. I could lose the game because of that. If he manages to get out afterwards, my position will be lost. All right, I'll play queen to c2. I'm bringing my queen back to defend b2 and f2. And I still have this threat of a decisive capture, though. He plays rook to c8. He wants to counterattack on the c file. So bishop takes, rook takes. His knight can't move, otherwise he loses his queen. Well, he can play knight to b4 to counterattack on my side. Rook takes, knight takes, he'll attack my rook, but then rook to c1. I think this is better for me, so I can go ahead and take the d6 pawn here. In any case, if there's a trap, I didn't see it. Maybe he started playing quickly simply because I didn't have much time left. I had used up a lot of time earlier. So I ended up winning that weakness of the backward d6 pawn. But now the position is going to open up, so I have to withstand the shock of the position opening. He's going to move his queen, probably to unpin his knight by attacking my rook. I don't know, maybe moves like queen to c5 and attacking the c4 pawn. That's what he should do, in my opinion, queen to c5. Afterwards, I can defend. I have queen to d3, which defends both the pawn and the rook. Maybe he'll try to put a rook on d8. I think I'm going to have to give back the pawn in this position. If he plays moves like queen to c5, then rook to d8, I'm not going to be able to defend everything. You see, he plays queen to c5. Queen to d3, careful, there's knight to b4. If I play queen to d4, if he takes, I'll have to recapture with the knight to control the c2 square. But then he'll take the c4 pawn with his rook. I can't manage to defend everything. I'm going to have to give up some material. I'm playing queen to d3, knight to b4, queen to d4. I know I'm going to have to give up some material. If queen takes, I can't recapture with the rook. Then knight to c2 forks both rooks. I'll have to recapture with the knight. I'm just barely holding things together here. He's going to take back the c4 pawn with a good position. It would be interesting to see in the analysis what I missed. The problem is that the lack of time here is becoming critical. So if I play knight to c2 right away, of course, I'll first exchange queens before saving that rook. And if he moves his queen, I'll have time to move my rook to deal with the c2 problem. And if queen takes, as we said, I'll recapture with the knight. What bothers me is rook to d8, but then he takes on c4 here. So maybe queen takes, rook takes, and then rook to b6 afterwards, attacking b7 and putting pressure on the knight. Or play rook to b6 right away, because if queen takes, I can also recapture with the knight. I'm going to take his queen. I can also double up on the file. He's attacking e4 here. I'm going to play rook to b6. I'm attacking b7. I'm counterattacking on b7. I have knight to d2, which can attack his rook and also protect e4. Now, I'm going to have to play very quickly. Fortunately, there's that little increment. It's 5 seconds per move. If he plays rook to b8, I'll play rook to d1. Now his rook takes on b7 because he won't be able to take due to the back rank mate threats. If I play rook to c7, I think I'll play rook to d1 anyway. He takes on e4. So here we trade and I take on b7. There's still pressure on his knight. That's interesting. The knight controls the e1 square, which means my rook can join the fight. But I'll lose the pawn on a2. Maybe I should play a3 first. He comes to attack, and I counterattack his knight. He goes back to d4, offering an exchange. All right, I accept. I'm going to attack his pawn now. And if he comes to defend, I can take his pawn because of the back rank mate. But careful, I also have a back rank mate problem. I'll need to create a little escape square for myself. He comes here, and there you go. He was threatening rook to d1, the back rank mate. That's why I couldn't take the pawn on a6, but now I can take the pawn on a6. I've given myself an escape square, whereas he still doesn't have his escape square. Endgame with rooks, escape squares. It's very important to avoid the back rank mate, of course. Okay, I keep attacking. Now he can play rook to d5, because if I take with the rook, he'll recapture with the pawn. I'm going to play rook, c5, doubling the attacks on the a5 pawn. He goes there, and now I can take the a5 pawn, and I've won a pawn. Now I have two connected passed pawns, which is very interesting in the endgame. He gives a check. He's going to try to counterattack on the second rank to attack f2. And there you go. That's what he does. That's going to be annoying. He's attacking b2. He's going to prepare to double the rooks here. How am I going to do this? If I play rook to b5, he'll go there. I'll come to c3. He'll go to e2. I'll play f3, maybe something like that. All right, rook to b5. He comes here. All right, I push the a pawn. I know he can take the b2 pawn. Maybe I should have pushed earlier, but I don't have much time left. I push my pawn. He's going to come behind to control it. And this is going to end in a draw, this position. He has an extra pawn on the king side, but I have this pass pawn on the queen side. Let's give a little check. I come back to defend. I could have put my rook behind, but even if I push the pawn afterwards, I'm still a bit stuck. If his king disconnects from the f7 pawn, I'll play rook to b7 and try to trade the a5 pawn for the f7 pawn. We'll have the same number of pawns on the same side. It's probably a draw. It'll be a draw, by the way. Because even with one less pawn on the same side, it's still a draw. So if we have the same number of pawns, it'll be a draw. But since his pawns will be a bit damaged, I can still try to get something out of the position. It'll be a draw, of course, but if the opponent plays badly, you can always win. So he comes to pin my f-pawn. All right. He'll want to play e5, e4, e3, you see. Well, I'll wait. He might play f6, and I'll keep the pin on the 5th rank so the pawn can't advance. He plays f6. Should I play king f3 question mark? Maybe. King f3 anyway. He can't play e4. He's pinned. He checks me. I move back. And now it's the moment of truth. We'll see what he plans to do. I'm going to give a check and then come back to attack on the 6th rank. Unless he comes back to f5. I'll come back to the 5th rank. But if he starts to go on an adventure, I'll go back to b6. My goal is to trade this pawn for one of the pawns here. For now, things are neutralizing. We might end up with a draw. He comes here. I keep the pin on the 5th rank. I don't want the pawn to be able to advance. Otherwise, at some point, he could hit my f-pawn by coming to e3, and that could be dangerous for my king. And that's a draw by triple repetition, meaning we've repeated the same position 3 times, so that results in a draw. And now it's time to see, in Zen mode, what my opponent's rating was. That's about to be revealed to us. So my opponent is rated 2177. In the time control we played, and in faster time controls, we can see he's also rated over 2100. In slower time controls, he's rated 2000, but there's a question mark next to his rating, which means he hasn't played enough games for it to be truly indicative. We can see that in total, across all time controls, he's played quite a few games. 2,854, and he's been playing on the platform for 4 years. Liches. So, according to the computer, I have 88% accuracy, just like my opponent, which probably explains the draw. But you can see I made 2 blunders because there were 2 moments when I could have won. It was in a rook endgame. I'll show you the position. So, the first moment is here. I attack the pawn on a 5, and my opponent plays rook to d5 to defend it laterally. And I didn't have much time left on the clock. I had 30 seconds, but I still could have spotted the winning move. I had to take his tower. He cannot take a rook because of the back row mate, so he would have taken a pawn. And now tower c5, and he cannot defend both pawns. So if he plays d4, I will have to play king f1, bring my king back to block his pawn. For example, d3, king e1, d2, king d1. And the pawn on a5, like the pawn on d2, are vulnerable and will be eliminated in this endgame, giving white a decisive advantage. But in this position, I didn't exchange on d5. I played rook to c5. So that was my first blunder because I missed the winning transition in the endgame. But here I played this move to increase the pressure on a5, but also to threaten capturing on d5. And then he plays g6 to solve the back rank mate problems. And I make another mistake. I still have about 30 seconds on the clock, and I take the pawn on a5, telling myself that it's fine, that this capture on a5 will guarantee me 2 connected passed pawns in the endgame. But after rook takes a5, we saw that he came into my position with rook to d1, check, king to g2, and rook to d2. And this entry on d2 will allow him to find counterplay by attacking b2, but also gives the rooks the possibility to double up on the second rank to attack the pawn on f2. So what should I have played here? Well, I shouldn't have taken the pawn on f5. Still, it was really tempting. You have to admit that. No, I should have taken on d5. If he recaptures with the pawn, it's the same line I showed you earlier. We take the pawn on a5 and the d-pawn. We'll contain it with the king, and then we'll have those 2 extra pawns. And even the d-pawn will become fragile. And if he doesn't push the d-pawn, we'll even be able to advance the king and surround him to try to eliminate him. And we still have the 2 passed pawns on the queen side. And it's much harder for him to find counterplay with just 1 rook than with both rooks. And if he takes with the rook, well then I can exchange the rooks, and the endgame is winning. Because my king will come to attack the d-pawn, his king will come to defend it, and maybe you've seen my video on endgames. And in my video on endgames, I tell you that the ultimate weapon in endgames is the distant passed pawns. And the idea is that with my pawn majority, I'm going to create a distant passed pawn. He'll have to take, I'll recapture, and I'll have this distant passed pawn. His king will have to go stop the pawn. Meanwhile, I can take the d-pawn, and my king will be closer to the rest of the pawns to win this endgame. So you might ask me why I didn't do it. If I had had more time, I certainly would have thought of it. The problem is that when you're in time trouble, you miss things. Winning moves for me, for you, even for grandmasters, by the way. So there you have it. I still have progress to make in endgames. I hope the video was informative and that you also found it entertaining. We'll be able to meet again soon for new adventures. Don't forget to leave me likes, comments, share the video, support the channel. I need it. All right, goodbye everyone.